My sister raised her glass and called me just a nurse. The room laughed until the groom's father looked at me like he'd seen a ghost and said 5 words that changed everything. The microphone feedback cut through the jazz band like a knife, and 200 people went quiet at once. Richard Whitmore was not a man who needed a room's permission to speak. He was 71 years old, 6 feet tall, and had the kind of presence that made lesser men stand up straighter without knowing why. He had built 3 companies from nothing. He had survived a heart attack at 63 and a car accident that should have killed him at 68. He did not ask for attention. He simply had it. And right now, every bit of it was pointed directly at me, at table 18, closest to the kitchen, farthest from the chandelier, the table where they put the people who had to be invited but didn't need to be seen. I was still holding my champagne glass from my stepsister Victoria's toast, the toast where she had raised her flute toward the Whitmore family, smiled her $10,000 smile, and introduced me to the room with 2 words that had been following me my entire life. Just a nurse. The room had laughed. My father had laughed first. The full, easy laugh of a man who found this genuinely funny, not performative, not nervous, real. The kind of laugh that tells you everything you need to know about where you stand with someone. I had swallowed it. I was very good at swallowing things. And then Richard Whitmore had gone completely still. He'd been looking at me across the ballroom with an expression I couldn't read, like a man watching something surface from deep water. And he'd said 5 words into the silence. Wait, that was you? Now he was standing at the front of the room with a microphone, and the jazz band had stopped playing, and Victoria's smile had gone glassy at the edges, and I was sitting at table 18 in my $45 Target dress, trying to remember how to breathe. I need to back up to the rain. But first I need to tell you about my mother's pearl earrings, because they matter more than anything else in this story. My mother's name was Carol Ann Brooks. She was an RN for 26 years at Morristown Medical Center, and she wore the same 2 pearl studs every single day. Small, cream-colored, slightly imperfect in the way real pearls are, because my father had given them to her on their first anniversary before he became someone else entirely. She wore them through 12-hour shifts and 2 rounds of chemotherapy and the last 6 months of her life when she was mostly in bed, and the earrings were one of the few things she still put on every morning because she said it made her feel like herself. She died on a Tuesday in March, 8 years ago. I was 22. I had just finished my 2nd year of nursing school. I took the earrings from her bedside table the morning after she died, and I have worn them every day since. Not as grief, not as performance, as a reminder of what it meant to show up for people. My mother believed, with her whole unremarkable, extraordinary self, that nursing was a calling, not a consolation prize, not a fallback, a calling, the kind that asked you to carry other people's worst days and not be destroyed by them. She passed that belief to me the same way she passed me her cheekbones and her stubbornness, and I have spent 8 years trying to be worthy of it. Victoria would describe this as my being dramatic about a job. Victoria would know. She had spent the better part of 2 decades deciding what I was and wasn't allowed to be. My father, Gerald Brooks, remarried when I was 9 years old. His second wife was named Sandra, sleek, careful Sandra, with her highlighted hair and her charity board memberships, and the particular social fluency of a woman who had clawed her way to a certain tax bracket and was not about to let anything threaten the view. Sandra had a daughter from her first marriage. Victoria was 4 years older than me and had the ruthless, patient efficiency of someone who had grown up watching her mother maneuver. I want to be fair about this. There was a version of Victoria that was tolerable, even occasionally kind. In small private moments she'd probably deny now. But the public Victoria, the social Victoria, the Victoria who understood that status is zero-sum and had decided that my existence complicated the picture she was trying to present. That Victoria had been filing me down since I was 9 years old. She was subtle about it. I'll give her that. It was never one big moment you could point to. It was 1,000 small ones. The birthday party invitations that got lost. The school events my father didn't know about because Sandra had seen the flyer first. The years of Reagan's so quiet. Isn't she and Reagan doesn't really do well in big groups. And Reagan has always been a little sensitive. Each sentence landed softly and left no visible mark, and collectively built a picture, over years, of a girl who was somehow less than the room she was standing in. By the time Victoria started dating James Whitmore at 28, I was in my 3rd year as an ER nurse and entirely used to the picture. James was everything the Whitmore name suggested. Educated, polished, generous in the way that came easy when money wasn't a variable. He was also, from everything I could observe at the 3 family dinners I was included in before Victoria stopped including me, genuinely decent. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He made my father laugh in a way that wasn't at anyone's expense. He deserved to know the truth about who he was marrying. But Victoria had gotten there first. The thing about Victoria's campaign to make me invisible to the Whitmore family is that it was architecturally elegant. I only understood its full shape in retrospect. It started, I think, with the phrasing. The first time James met me at a dinner at my father's house about 18 months into their relationship, Victoria had introduced me with the specific lightness of someone conveying subtext. This is my stepsister Reagan. She works nights, she's kind of a homebody, she's always been a little, and then a smile and a small shrug that finished the sentence without words. I noticed it. I told myself I was being paranoid. 3 months later, at another dinner, I mentioned something that had happened at the hospital, a trauma case, the kind of thing that sticks with you, and Victoria made a face across the table, subtle, aimed at James, a face that said, "Here she goes." He didn't ask follow-up questions. I noticed that too. The following spring, I ran into James's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, at a charity event I'd attended with a coworker. Eleanor was gracious and warm, and she looked at me with a very particular, careful kindness, the kind people deploy when they've been told to be gentle. When I mentioned I was a nurse, she said, "Oh yes, Victoria mentioned you've had a hard time of it." She didn't specify. She moved on quickly. I drove home that night and sat in my apartment for an hour trying to identify the specific shape of what was happening. I called my father. "Has Victoria said anything to you about what she tells the Whitmore family about me?" I asked. He paused. "What do you mean?" "Eleanor Whitmore said Victoria mentioned I'd had a hard time of it. I don't know what that means." A longer pause. "Reagan, Victoria's just trying to keep the peace. You know you can be a lot sometimes." A lot. I wrote it in my phone's notes app, not because I was building a case, but because I had learned from experience that the gaslit mind forgets. I was keeping receipts for myself. "What does a lot mean, Dad?" "You're very intense. Your job makes you intense. It's not a criticism." I said goodnight and hung up. The wedding invitation arrived 4 months later. My name was misspelled. Reagan with an A, which was either a mistake or a statement, and with Victoria, it was genuinely impossible to know. No +1, though I'd been seeing someone for 8 months. Table assignment, 18. I looked up table 18 on the venue's floor plan, which Victoria had shared in the family group chat, with the thoroughness of a general mapping a campaign. Table 18 was between the service corridor and the emergency exit. There were 9 tables between it and the head table. I could not tell you exactly why I decided to go anyway. Maybe stubbornness, maybe some vestigial hope that my father would look at me at some point during the evening and see me, maybe something else, something quieter, something I wasn't consciously articulating even to myself. I put on my Target dress. I put on my mother's pearl earrings. I drove to the Whitmore estate on a Saturday in June. I want to tell you about the rain before I tell you what happened at the wedding. I want to tell you about it properly, the way it actually was, not the way Richard Whitmore would describe it later, with the warmth of a man for whom the story had a good ending. For me, at the time, it was just a Tuesday, November 14th, 3 years ago. I was driving home from a double shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and then 3 more hours because a multi-vehicle accident had come in at 6:45, and I don't leave in the middle of things. It was 10:23 p.m. by the time I got on I-287 northbound, and the rain was the kind that makes the road look liquid, that turns headlights into smears, that asks more of your attention than you have after 14 hours on your feet. I almost missed it. The car was a black Mercedes, late model, driver's side wrapped around the concrete median barrier, with the specific violence of a high-speed impact that had happened recently enough that the hazard lights were still blinking. I saw the lights before I registered the shape. I pulled over on instinct, the instinct of 8 years in emergency medicine, the instinct that doesn't ask permission. There was a man in the driver's seat, older, silver-haired, conscious but altered, the look of someone whose body has mobilized every resource it has just to stay present. His seatbelt had locked on impact and was the only thing keeping him upright. The windshield was gone. The door was not going to open. I called 911 from outside the car, giving location and vitals as clearly as I could while I found the angle to reach him. The paramedic dispatcher, a woman who sounded like she'd been doing this for 20 years and probably had, told me units were 12 minutes out. There was a secondary accident 2 exits back. 12 minutes. I said I was a nurse and I was going to stay on scene. I got through the passenger window. The man's name, I would learn later, was Richard Whitmore. But that night, he was just a man who was bleeding from a head laceration, who had potential cervical spine involvement based on the mechanism of injury, who was showing signs of early hemorrhagic shock, and who was alone in a car on a rain-soaked highway at 10:23 p.m., with 12 minutes between him and professional help. I held his head. Both hands, firm and steady, immobilizing the cervical spine the way you learn in trauma training, and practice 100 times, and then do, when the moment comes, with your whole body, because there is no partial version of keeping someone's spine intact. I talked to him, not because they tell you to, although they do, but because silence in those situations has a weight that people can lose themselves in. I told him the ambulance was coming. I told him he was not going to die tonight. And then, because I needed him to focus on something specific, something real and gentle that wasn't the pain or the blood or the rain, I told him about my mother's pearl earrings. I told him she had worn them every day for 26 years. I told him she was a nurse too. I told him that the earrings weren't valuable in any objective sense, but that they were the most important objects I owned, because they meant that showing up for people was worth something, even when it cost you. He stayed conscious. He stayed conscious for 47 minutes, until the paramedics arrived and I stepped back and gave them the handoff report the way I would have in my own ER. Mechanism of injury, neurostatus, cervical spine precautions, estimated blood loss, and they looked at me with the particular expression of paramedics who have arrived at a scene and found it better managed than they expected. Richard Whitmore went to St. Luke's University Hospital. The surgical team that received him included Dr. Anitha Rajan, trauma surgery attending, and Dr. Marcus Fell, neurosurgery fellow, both of whom would later note in the patient's chart that the cervical spine management at scene had likely prevented a life-altering or fatal spinal cord injury. I know this because St. Luke's sent me a formal commendation letter 6 weeks later, signed by the chief of surgery, Dr. Harriet Voss. I put the letter in a folder. I didn't tell anyone. There is no satisfying explanation for why. It wasn't false modesty. lie. It wasn't indifference. It was something closer to what my mother used to say about the work. You don't do it for the story. You do it because it needed doing. I went back to work the next Tuesday. I never told anyone. Not my coworkers, not my father, not Victoria, not until Richard Whitmore sat down at table 18. He found me between the entree and the toasts. I had been sitting alone for most of the evening. The other guests at table 18 were extended Whitmore family acquaintances who'd been politely confused by my presence and had mostly migrated toward better positioned seats as the night progressed, because table 18 was the kind of assignment people apologized for before they abandoned you to it. I was eating my salmon and trying to decide at what point it became acceptable to leave a wedding you'd driven 90 minutes to attend, when I became aware of someone sitting down across from me, Richard Whitmore, in his tuxedo, at table 18 like he'd chosen it. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. "I've been trying to place you since you walked in," he said. His voice was quieter than I'd expected, not the voice he used for rooms, something more private. I told myself it couldn't be. The hair was different, the setting was different. I set down my fork. "But then Victoria introduced you," he continued, "and she said just a nurse. And I thought, no, that's not right. That's not the right word for what that person is." My chest had gone very still. "And then I saw your earrings." His eyes were on my mother's pearl studs. Two small, imperfect, cream-colored pearls, catching the low light of the Whitmore estate tent. "You told me about them," he said. "In the car, on the highway." A pause. "In the rain." His jaw tightened, not in anger, in the specific way of a man who is keeping something contained because the room is watching. "It's you," he said. His eyes had filled, not dramatically, not suddenly, just with the absolute certainty of a man who has been carrying a debt for 3 years and has just found the person he owes it to. He stood up. He picked up the microphone from the bandstand. "Most of you know," Richard began, his voice filling the tent like the man filled a room, without apparent effort, by simple force of presence, "that 3 years ago, I almost died." Victoria's smile, from her position at the head table, was the smile of a woman watching her father-in-law do something she didn't yet understand but was prepared to welcome. This was the patriarch welcoming her into the family. This was the moment she had been building toward. She had no idea. "For 47 minutes, Richard continued. "Before any ambulance arrived, before any rescue equipment, before any professional help, one person kept me alive." He turned. He looked across 9 tables, past the Whitmores and the country club friends, and the business associates, past the chandeliers and the floral arrangements and the careful architecture of a wedding designed to say this family is something. He looked at me. "Her name is Reagan Brooks." His voice dropped lower and somehow carried further. "And 20 minutes ago, in this room, she was introduced to you as just a nurse." The silence had a weight to it, the kind that settles in after the last vibration of sound, the kind where you can hear ice shifting in glasses. "Let me tell you what just a nurse means." He held the microphone like a man who had given speeches his entire life and understood that this one was different. "It means driving home after a 14-hour shift and stopping anyway. It means climbing through a broken window in the rain, in the dark, in broken glass, alone. It means holding a stranger's head perfectly still with your bare hands for 47 minutes so his spine doesn't sever. And you know, if you've met a nurse, that they know exactly what they're doing when they do that. It's not instinct. It's years of training, applied under pressure for a stranger in the middle of the night for nothing." He reached into his jacket pocket. He held up his phone, and on the screen, visible to the people nearest the stage, readable to the room by context, was a document, a letter, hospital letterhead, and at the bottom of it, a signature I recognized. Dr. Harriet Voss, Chief of Surgery, St. Luke's University Hospital. "The surgical team's official assessment," Richard said, "was that the cervical spine management at scene likely prevented a life-altering or fatal injury." Their words, not mine. He lowered the phone. "And while she was doing this," he said, "she talked to me, so I wouldn't lose consciousness. She told me about her mother's pearl earrings." He paused. "The ones she's wearing right now." The first person who started clapping was Eleanor Whitmore, Richard's wife, from the head table. She stood up when she did it, then the table beside her, then a spreading wave, not the polite wedding applause of people following social cues, but the real kind, the kind that has weight behind it that means something. 200 people stood up. I sat at table 18 and could not tell you what my face was doing. My hands were flat on the tablecloth. My eyes were burning in a way I was not going to let become visible if I could help it. Victoria had not moved. Her face had gone the color of the tablecloth. James was looking at her. The room took a long time to settle. Richard sat back down at table 18. There were people who came to him, hands extended, the social machinery of a party reasserting itself, but he stayed in his chair and let them come to him rather than move, and that gesture alone told me something about how seriously he meant this. He stayed until the crowd thinned. Then he looked at me across the table. "You never said anything," he said, "in 3 years." "No. Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because it didn't need saying," I said. "You walked out of the hospital. That was the point." He was quiet for a moment. "Your stepsister told my son you had mental health issues," he said. His voice was careful. "That you were prone to instability. That including you in family events was complicated. The salmon was cold on my plate." I looked at it. "I know," I said. "You knew she was telling them that." "I suspected," I said. "I didn't know the specific words until now." His jaw tightened again. "My son believed her. My wife was careful with you at events because she'd been told to be gentle." He shook his head, a small, precise motion. 2 years of deliberate misinformation. "She's thorough," I said, which was true. I had always given Victoria credit it for thoroughness. She's going to answer for it, Richard said. And then James arrived at the table. James Whitmore, in the months I had observed him from table 18 and farther, had always seemed like a man who processed things carefully before he spoke. He sat down in the chair Richard vacated, looked at me for a moment, and said, "Tell me what you know. All of it. Whatever she's told you, whatever you've noticed." I told him. Not everything. There were years of small things that would take days to catalog, but the shape of it. The introductions calibrated to lower the ceiling. Eleanor's Victoria mentioned you've had a hard time of it. The invitation with my name misspelled and no +1 and table 18. The family dinner where Victoria's face had made the statement she hadn't needed to voice. I pulled out my phone, the Notes app. 18 months of small observations, quietly documented. James read without speaking. When he finished, he set the phone down and pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He did this for perhaps 5 seconds, a man compressing something large into a manageable shape. Then he walked to the head table. I could not hear the conversation. The band had resumed tentatively, and the tent noise had rebuilt to something close to normal, and they were close together and speaking quietly. But I could see it. Victoria's hands going to her necklace, the strand of diamonds James had given her for their first Christmas together. Her nervous habit. I'd watched her do it my whole life whenever something got away from her. James's face, not angry, worse than angry, resolved. Her trying to smile, the smile not working, and the tent was not as loud as she thought, or she had miscalculated in the specific way people miscalculate when panic overtakes precision. She should have stayed invisible. The table next to the head table heard it, and the table next to that, and the sound moved through the room the way sounds move in tented spaces, unpredictably and completely, and the 200 people who had just given me a standing ovation heard Victoria Whitmore Brooks say, on her wedding day, that her stepsister should have stayed invisible. The silence that followed was different from the silence after Richard's speech. That silence had been reverent. This one was the silence of 200 people simultaneously recalibrating every assumption they'd brought into the room. James's voice was very quiet. I read his lips for the first words. Here's what's going to happen. What happened in the days after the wedding I know partly from what I witnessed, and partly from what was reported back to me by people I trusted. I'll tell you only what I can verify. James hired a family attorney within 48 hours. Her name was Carolyn Reyes, and she had 23 years of experience in marital and family law in New Jersey, and she was, by all accounts, meticulous. The prenuptial agreement James had signed, standard for a Whitmore family marriage, contained a specific clause about material misrepresentation. Richard's attorney, a man named Douglas Park, who had been with the Whitmore family for 15 years, confirmed that Victoria's 2-year campaign of misinformation about me to the Whitmore family met the standard threshold. The marriage was 6 days old when James filed for annulment. Carolyn Reyes emailed me a week after the wedding to request a formal statement. I provided it. 22 pages of documented observations, cross-referenced with dates, including my Notes app entries, 3 emails from family group chats, and a screenshot of the original wedding invitation with my misspelled name and table 18 assignment, which I had photographed when it arrived because some part of me always photographed things. She thanked me and told me the statement was thorough. "You documented all of this as it was happening?" she asked during our phone call. "Since I was 19, I said. I grew up in that house. You learn." A brief pause. "Smart," she said. "There was a custody and financial hearing 6 weeks later. I was not involved in it directly. What I know is that the prenuptial clause held that the annulment was granted on the grounds of misrepresentation, and that the social fallout in my father's world, the country club world, the charity board world, the world Victoria had spent 2 decades constructing herself into, was significant in the particular way that matters in those environments. Reputational, lasting, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't go away. My father called me 3 weeks after the wedding. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 4 sentences. He said he hadn't known. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know if I'd want to talk, but if I did, he was there. I listened to it twice. I did not call back immediately. I called Dr. Simone Adeyemi first. Dr. Adeyemi had her doctorate in clinical psychology from Columbia and had been my therapist for 2 years. I'd started seeing her after my mother died, stopped when I convinced myself I was fine, and restarted 8 months before the wedding when I stopped convincing myself. She had a particular way of asking questions that made space without filling it, and when I called her the Monday after the wedding and told her everything that had happened, she let me talk for 25 minutes straight without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How does it feel?" she asked, not meaning the wedding, meaning all of it, the accumulated weight of what had been named, out loud, by someone else, in a room of 200 people. I thought about Richard Whitmore standing at the front of the tent with a microphone, looking across 9 tables at me, like being found, I said, after a very long time of not being looked for. She didn't say anything for a moment, then, "That's the right word for it." I called my father back 2 weeks later. The conversation was not easy, and it was not resolved in a single phone call. Those conversations aren't, and I'm suspicious of the version of this story where they are. But it was real, which is more than most of what had passed between us for 20 years. He cried, which I had not expected. He said I let her tell me who you were instead of watching for myself. He said it like a man who understood the specific failure that was. I didn't forgive him in that phone call, but I didn't close the door. Richard Whitmore sent a letter to the nursing administration at Morristown Medical Center where I worked. He sent a copy to the chief of nursing, one to the hospital CEO, and one to the New Jersey State Nurses Association. The letter described described the incident on I-287 in clinical and personal detail, cited Dr. Harriet Voss's commendation, and nominated me for the NJSNA's Professional Excellence Award, which I was told is one of about 40 given statewide each year and is not, as far as I'm aware, the kind of thing you get because a billionaire writes a letter. You have to earn it through peer review and documented patient outcomes and the opinion of people who have watched you work. I earned it. I want to be clear about that, but the letter didn't hurt. The night I found out I'd received the award, I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. It was November, cold but clear, and the sky had that particular depth it gets in late fall when the air is dry and you can see further than you expect. I sat beside her headstone for a while. I'm not going to tell you I talked to her. I'm not going to tell you I felt her presence or heard her voice or experienced anything that required you to believe in things beyond the ordinary. I will tell you that I touched my ear, just the left one where the pearl earring sits, and that it felt like something, like weight, like history, like showing up for people was worth something, even when it cost you, especially when it cost you. Victoria sent me one message, 11 weeks after the wedding. Not a call. She knew better than to call. A text, brief, in the middle of the night. I hope you're happy. I read it at 6:47 a.m. and coming off a night shift, standing in the hospital parking lot in the gray early light with my coffee and my badge and my mother's pearl earrings, I thought about answering. I thought about happy as a word, what it meant, what she thought it meant, what she believed she had done to me, and what she believed the last 3 months had done to her. I put my phone in my pocket. I drove home. Some things don't need an answer. The record had already spoken in a room of 200 people, and it had said everything that needed saying. She called me just a nurse. The room stood up.